hear from the host company's point of view versus just the individual participant. So it really is a value add to the company as well. So next up, our second panel is on the role of higher education in preparing students for the work ahead. Leading the panel today is Bersia, who, among many other things, is the executive producer and host of the award-winning show Global Perspectives. Joining us today from the University of Central Florida, John.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be with my esteemed co-panelists here. I'll introduce them first. To my far left is Dr. Cheryl Matherly, who is Vice President and Vice Provost for National Affairs at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, which has played a key role in every industrial revolution that we have had in this country, including the one we're going through currently. And to my immediate left is Dr. Norah McRae, who has been introduced and who has spoken already, but in her new capacity as Associate Director for Co-operative and Experiential Education at Waterloo University. So pleasure to have both of you. You are the experts. I'm simply facilitating. I wear several hats at the University of Central Florida. You mentioned PBS, which is a wonderful opportunity for the university. My main job is directing Global Perspectives for the university, and basically my work falls into three areas: thought leadership, critical and emerging issues where we develop programs, institutes, things like that we incubate and then move into academic departments, and then last but not least, a sort of international training academy, if you will, where we equip students with special skills that they're not getting in the classroom and in other experiences on campus. And just to give you an example, this started as an experiment several years ago. We had just a few interns and fellows each term. Now we do about 50 of them a year. And the plan is to double this every year for the next 4 or 5 years until we have this large cohort. But just the other day, the students in the program, there's about 15 or so every semester, had the opportunity to sit down in a national security writing workshop with a prominent instructor in the subject area from the University of Southern California, just to give you one example. So we're always looking for new opportunities to add offerings to what they get in this very, very special setting. But what I would like to do is turn to my colleagues. I know we've discussed this a little bit, but each of you has, at your institutions, has worked on programs, initiatives, and so forth that address this future of work issue. And so why don't we start with Cheryl and give us a couple of examples of what you're working on.
Sure. Well, first I'm delighted to be here, and this is a topic that is something that's very important to what we talk about at Lehigh University. And I think to get into this, I can take just a couple minutes to say a few words about Lehigh, because, John, you referenced some of our history, which is really quite relevant to this conversation. So Lehigh University is located in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour and a half from here, from New York. But Bethlehem, probably most people recognize it because of Bethlehem Steel, which was the second largest U.S. steel manufacturer. And Bethlehem Steel was headquartered just about a mile from the Lehigh campus. And the story of Bethlehem Steel is really one of the story of the history of American manufacturing to this. And Bethlehem was truly a one industry town. It was really the major employer, but also very tightly connected to the story of Lehigh for a very long time. Well, we know what happened to Bethlehem Steel, that by mid-90s was bankrupt, and by 2001 doors closed. And all of a sudden, as the mayor of Bethlehem reminds us, that overnight the unemployment rate in the city of Bethlehem jumped by about 25%. And that had tremendous impact also on the university, which had been founded as an engineering university, one that has its deep roots in materials, in construction, and civil engineering to that, and so very much tied to that kind of history as well. Well, when something like that happens, it really puts you into the position of kind of reconsidering where do you fit to this. And the story of Bethlehem and indeed northeastern Pennsylvania now is a really exciting one of kind of redirection towards manufacturing, re-engineering itself as being a kind of a high-end manufacturing zone. There's quite a lot to talk about to that. But into this also comes a really kind of key question of the university reconsidering who is it that we're educating and what are we preparing students for as well. And that's exactly where we sit now. And so that is being sort of reconsidered to how do you stay sort of true to your roots as a solid technical school with that and a solid background in this kind of work of professional learning and professional experience. But look at the kinds of changes in the work world that our first panel really talked about. Probably, and there's two directions that is happening that I think are probably the most exciting to that. We're really reconsidering and rethinking the direction of the kind of students that we're educating. And one of the ways that that's happening is with something that's called the Mountaintop Initiative. Mountaintop is an initiative around creative inquiry and looking at that we're training students to be thinking differently about how they enter the work world. So certainly still staying deeply steeped in the kinds of professional learning that they need to have, the kind of engineering skills, the kind of skills, the content knowledge, but thinking instead about creating, providing students the kind of experiences to be working in interdisciplinary teams on problems that they learn to define and identify themselves, much more around the kind of self-directed learning to this, the emphasis around lifelong learning to that. And it's really become a kind of campus initiative to be kind of bringing this kind of models of creative inquiry across all disciplines to be creating students who are prepared around that area to that. The second space that this is happening is with work that we're doing in the area of entrepreneurial mindset, of looking at how then, if world of work is changing, if kind of jobs that students are doing, that they need to be in a position to be able to think about how to define their own problems and define their own solutions. And so we're doing quite a lot in that space also around kind of entrepreneurial learning, not so much how to start a business, but rather how to think entrepreneurially around that with kind of experiences there. And I'll say then, sort of overlaying this, and then come back and talk more about this in subsequent pieces, sort of overlaying in this is looking at what that means to have students then who are globally engaged. If you think about the kinds of creative inquiry problems or the ways that people define problems differently, doing that in an international, cross-cultural, global perspective is really essential to that. And so our international piece, our international programs are pretty central with that as well. So,
Okay, Norah, your experience in your main field of work at Waterloo is not just outstanding in terms of the university, in terms of the country, but in terms of the world. You provide the most services of this kind of any institution that I can think of, academic institution. Tell us how that evolved and in connection with this issue, how important is it to be in that place in terms of...
Great. Thank you. Yeah. So as I mentioned in my remarks when I was welcoming you all here, the University of Waterloo started over 62 years ago with this notion of hands-on learning being integrated completely into the curriculum. And as a result, that start was 75 engineering students. We now have 36,000 students on our campus and 21,000 work terms every year that are happening in 62 different countries. What that has done is that, first of all, our institution is quite unique in the sense that it's a tri-semester program. There are always classes going on all the time. It's not like anyone's going on summer break or anything like that, because in order to facilitate students coming in, and as I'm sure you all understand what the program is, students study for a semester, then they go out in full-time paid work for a semester, they come back and study for a semester, they go out in full-time work for a semester. And it works like that so that they're doing at least 4 or sometimes 6 work terms over the course of their degree. So they're graduating with a top-notch degree as well as up to 2 years of relevant paid work experience under their belt. Now, why do we do that? because it's very complicated. It's difficult for faculty sometimes to wrap their heads around that. It's difficult for institutions to make that happen in a meaningful way. It creates challenges for curriculum development and pedagogy and all sorts of things. But why do we do that? And we do that because of the roots of the institution that come from that kind of applied learning mentality. The region, it's similar in the sense that the region used to be textile manufacturing, was part of the heart of the region, which evaporated, and so a rethink on what to do in the region has resulted in some changes, which speaks directly to this future of work. I'm sure you've heard of the term VUCA, V-U-C-A, that the future that we're facing is one that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So if that's what we're facing, and I think all the speakers this morning spoke to that, and I think you just have to turn on the television or go on to whatever on the internet for 2 seconds and you'll see that. So what is it that we need to do to be preparing our students for this kind of future? And of course we have a mechanism in place. They've got these co-op work terms, so that's great, they're having these experiences, but what are we wrapping around those experiences before, during, and after, so they're prepared for this future? Because experience, as we well know, in and of itself is not enough. It's how you learn from those experiences, how you develop those learning to learn, lifelong learning capabilities that enable you to do the adaptation that you're going to need and develop the capabilities you're going to need to face this future. And the Royal Bank of Canada has come out with some really interesting work in this space, Future Launch, I don't know if people are familiar with that, but they've identified 4 key human skills that are going to be required to work effectively with AI and automation and all of these changes that we've just been talking about. So those future skills are those human skills. So what can humans bring that machines can't? Humans bring creativity, curiosity, collaboration, and communication. So those are the 4 C's that this report and some people are thinking about are the capabilities that we need to develop in our young people. So how do we do that? How do you develop collaboration? How do you develop communication? What are the mechanisms to do that? As Associate Provost for Co-operative and Experiential Education, we're looking at those forms of those educational models as ways to give students experiences which help develop those capabilities. And I would say, that in addition to those 4 C's, there are a few other C's that we need to be thinking about. And specifically within the context of this gathering, cultural competence. Because we are in a global world, we are interacting with all sorts of cultures, and whether one travels abroad or not, we are in very diverse workplaces all the time. And so how to navigate that space in a way that is competent and effective. And I think another C that's really important is critical thinking, critical analysis. I think that increasingly we're going to be graduating students who are not going to be happily transitioning to industry, because industry may not be there, but it really is going to be people who can think for themselves, be innovative, identify problems, be able to solve those problems. And I think another C that's often missing from the scene is compassion. And that comes from understanding. And fundamentally, that's what an educational program should be about, is developing that capability in people. And my goodness, we certainly seem to need a lot of it right now. So a couple of initiatives at the University of Waterloo. We've talked about the co-op program, and of course there's lots of information on that if you'd like it. But a couple of very interesting things, and this comes back to textile manufacturing going away and how did the region reinvent itself. And one of the ways that it's definitely reinvented itself was around innovation and being an innovation hub for Canada. Out of that, we have a couple of things that the University of Waterloo is very engaged with, and one is called Velocity. And it's a startup incubator space for individuals, students, and others who have ideas and they want to bring those ideas to some form of fruition. In addition to having co-op right from the beginning at Waterloo, the other policy is that IP, intellectual property, is owned by students, faculty, staff. Everybody owns their own IP. So that has enabled a nurturing ground for innovation and invention. So Velocity is a place where students can come, for example, with ideas, business ideas, startup ideas they might have, go to Velocity and get supported, mentored. There supports around them to help them evolve those ideas. So that, again, that's really nurturing that innovation and that agency and that self-directed future that I think we really need these young people to have. And where do they get those ideas? Often they're exposed to those ideas because they've been on a co-op work term somewhere. They've been out in industry, 3, 4 different industries, and they say, whoa, this is a really interesting idea that's popping up. How can I do something with that? So it all feeds into the ecosystem. And another initiative that Waterloo has is something called the Problem Lab, because there is the need to be able to identify problems, what are real problems, what are critical problems, and then be able to iterate solutions to those problems. So again, Problem Lab is another place that we do this, bringing together teams of students with support, looking at solutions, whether they're solutions that result in a startup company or whether they're solutions that result in some kind of social innovation or social entrepreneurship.
Very, very good. I was listening to your list of C's, and I was thinking about civility specifically. And civility obviously is included in some of the areas that you mentioned, but my colleague, the very respected former ambassador Harriet Elam Thomas, who heads our diplomacy studies program and came out with a new book called Diversifying Diplomacy in December, recently presented at the Civility Series in Stamford, Connecticut. And I think that it seems so obvious, but at the same time, people are not embracing it directly. We are in need of more civility training, in my opinion, today than I think we've ever been. And we don't get enough of it. And we think, oh, somebody else will pick that up. Well, maybe not. Maybe we need to think about including that more consciously. But as we go out into this world that you described as daunting and everything else, I mean, should we be afraid or should we be inspired by the challenge?
I think it's really inspiring, but I think that it also, though, requires that you have students that are ready there that are prepared with the kinds of skills to be working in this environment driven by VUCA. Which I agree with that. I mentioned, and so when I say inspiring in this, one of the things that I find that is a lot of fun in working on a college campus is that you do find that students are very rarely daunted by the big questions on things. And in fact, sometimes you almost wish they were a little more daunted before coming in with things. And I mentioned the Mountaintop Initiative. Let me tell just a little bit about it because I think it sort of gets to why I'm optimistic in this. So the idea behind Mountaintop, and the name for it, I might add, is because back to the story of Bethlehem Steel, about 5 years ago, the university acquired what had been the old R&D facilities for Beth Steel. And one of the things that if you're going to be doing steel research, you get massive buildings and that. So the university acquired what were essentially these big, massive hangars and had the interesting question of what do you do with this? There was something just almost inspiring about walking into these great big open spaces that really nothing had happened in them for about 20 years to do anything in it. And so started something with that's called the Mountaintop Initiative, with funding from two of our alums who had been the founders of Urban Outfitters. And one of the things you know about Urban Outfitters is very good about going into unusual spaces and repurposing it. And so that was what was sort of inspired them about this. And the idea with Mountaintop is that students come in with a question, a problem, something that's one of those big questions that they want to work on, and they have to define the problem, create their own teams. There's a little bit of funding to do this, but essentially they have to work to kind of solve whatever that issue is to that. And so the problems that you see students taking on kind of run the gamut, and they're really exciting. And so they are things like Beth on the Lehigh campus sits right on the side of Southside Bethlehem, which is a very diverse kind of working class community. It's where all the steel workers work to this. There's not a lot of public space interesting into this. So one of the challenges that the Mountaintop project took on was how could you create small parklets that would create kind of meaningful kind of community interactions to that, but you needed to do it on a $100 budget to this. And so we have this team of students who are suddenly there kind of daunted, taking on something with a lot of constraints to it, to create meaningful places where within a community, for $100, you can create a space where people come together and they have to think about from lots of perspectives of why would people come together? What would they be doing in that? What would be a value there for that? And so there's now all these little parklets around the campus that are places where there's community activities, some health services, all sorts of things that are kind of happening to that. We have students that are working on bigger, on things that are on kind of broad issues. So we have a team that was working with a group of Cambodian farmers who were doing low-cost mushroom development, and the project was how to work with these farmers to get these mushrooms to market quickly to this. And you've got teams, again, interdisciplinary, multi-background students coming in to tackle these issues to this. And what you see in this is that the students, these kind of experiences, and again, why I'm not sort of daunted with this, is that these are, you couldn't get projects that are more ambiguous, undefined, but have sort of big social implications to this. And require, to your point about civility, I'll say sort of the empathy, they require tremendous understanding of kind of the place, the communities they're going to be working with in order to find solutions. And these students are some, not only the brightest, but the most motivated, excited, who really see that they're making a difference there in the world. And instead of seeing kind of the daunting kind of world of all this change, rather see that as opportunity, and are more kind of ready to kind of define space in that. And I think that's where higher education is most effective with helping students kind of find their space to that and see that there as the opportunity, and recognize that it's not the kind of fixed jobs in the steel manufacturer they're going out to, but rather this future, this kind of place where they get to define their own space and make that kind of difference there to that.
Yeah, no, that's lovely, and a lovely example of the power of our students. I think to our peril, we underestimate what our students are capable of, actually. And our job really is to help prepare them and then get out of their way. And also allow them to make the impact they want to make and integrate that back into what we're doing, because that's a big piece that we often forget. But I think the last thing we want is fear, but I do think what we do want is to build resiliency. And resiliency is something that is very complicated, of course. And I think about the example of, someone mentioned Elon Musk, so it made me think of the Thai cave rescue, but in a good way. Mm-hmm. And when you think about what happened with those boys that were stuck in that Thai cave and how they got out, and it was an effort of individually, they were able to stay strong individually as young boys. It's pretty remarkable. They didn't freak out. They had team support. They all really banded together as a team. And they had amazing leadership with a coach who led them through it, did not freak out himself, and enabled that collectively to build that kind of resilience that allowed for a highly successful rescue mission. So if you think about that resilience, those ingredients in that resilience, so I think my point is it's a team effort. It's something that as educators we need to build the capacity within those students as individuals. We need to support their ability to work in teams collaboratively, because these complex problems and the world they're facing, they cannot be dealing, it's going to be very difficult to accomplish individually. And we need to be showing leadership. And the kind of leadership which isn't the sage on the stage telling them what to do or think, but it really is that coaching leadership to help them find their best selves, so that we can then get out of their way and have tremendous hope in the future, actually, because they better be capable of doing it, and we better not be afraid.
I think one last question.
Okay, I just wanted to continue in the vein that they were exploring. Our students are bold, and we should always encourage that type of approach. And I'll give you an example. One of my passions is human trafficking and modern slavery. This is an issue I've been working on for more than 25 years, and we recently stood up one of the most comprehensive interdisciplinary centers devoted to that subject at the University of Central Florida. I teach an honors class in human trafficking and global affairs, and the students, and they're very interested. We were talking about the future of work in that context, and they said, well, here's a great example of jobs that nobody was even thinking about, 20 years ago. What if we resolve this? What if we are the generation that manages to set free those 40 million people, or however many are believed to be enslaved around the world, there's going to be endless jobs bringing those folks back to the mainstream, educating them, training them, and everything else. And I thought, yeah, well, that's a very different way of looking at something that probably nobody else has come up with, at least in my awareness of things. But you just never know. So I don't think we can afford to be afraid. I think we need to be as bold as they are. And the world of work has changed a million times throughout history. We're going through it at a faster pace now. There's the technology piece and everything else. But I think you're right. A lot of jobs won't exist. Other jobs will. We have to be there to facilitate and make sure that we're providing not just a technical understanding of things, but the parameters in terms of management and ethics and everything else that make it all work well.
Absolutely. I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. Yes, Howard.
I want to bring up the issue of foreign language learning. My data may be old, but the last time I checked on it, something like 15 to 20% of Americans spoke a foreign language, 56% of Europeans. I'm particularly, and I want to just say before I pose the question, I think you can have compassion and civility and be globally effective without necessarily having foreign language skills. But I do think the depth and the ability to be effective in business is enhanced if you do have those skills. My specific question to both of you is, in your programs, particularly if you're sending people to 60 countries, Norah, does University of Waterloo require students to learn a foreign language, and does Lehigh? And generally as educators, what are your positions on that?
Okay. Who wants to go first? Sure. We do not require that they learn another language. As you can appreciate, our campus is very multicultural as it is. So many of those students, English is already an additional language to something they may have spoken at home. I'm not sure my colleagues from Waterloo can probably tell me this, but probably in our population, I suspect there are over 50 different languages going on anyway. So just acknowledging the diversity that already exists. But the approach that we take is around developing intercultural capability. And so you've probably heard the construct cultural intelligence, CQ, yeah? So knowledge is one, and knowledge of languages is part of that. And you're absolutely right. Language is important, and is a very important vehicle for appreciating culture and appreciating where people are coming from. There's no question about that. But there are other domains that are important in being effective. So to your point that you can have those qualities without necessarily having language is true. So there's knowledge of a culture, including language. There's your motivation, both intrinsic and extrinsic, around why you're engaging. There is your strategic metacognitive capabilities, as well as how you're showing up, and you're showing up appropriately. So no, we don't require a second language, and that's only one dimension of being effective interculturally, but we are looking to support all of those domains so that students are effective no matter where they go. Because you may be fluent in Spanish, for example, as an additional language, but what happens if you're working in Thailand? How many languages can you learn? So it really is having that capability and that openness to learn as much as you can that's appropriate.
This is a huge issue on our campus. In fact, Monday afternoon when I get back, I'm having a meeting with the Faculty of Modern Languages where we're talking about precisely this issue So for most of our programs, and truthfully, it's like a lot of the U.S. universities, there's not a requirement that students study language to go abroad. And there's also just a practical matter that if we did, the numbers, our rate of participation would drop, because if you look at trends with language learning in the United States, and enrollments in language programs, it's declining to that. I think part of it is exactly what Norah was saying, that you do need to decouple language learning from cultural competencies, and I think much like what is happening at Waterloo, we do put a real primacy on making sure that we're also talking about the kind of cross-cultural skills and wrap what we do with our internship programs and such around with that kind of learning and putting that emphasis there to that. But at the same time, I also worry, though, that universities sometimes work against ourselves and actually we make language learning difficult, and by virtue of making it so easy to go abroad and participate in things without language learning, that sometimes we send the wrong message ourselves there to students to this. And this is actually sort of much of the discussion that is happening with our modern language faculty to this, of the extent to which, to some extent, we're our own worst enemies, and that there are just things, and I'll use as an example of this. University of Rhode Island was one of the first universities in the United States to develop dual degree engineering and language programs. And one of the critical ways that they found to actually make this work, where students could do an entire bachelor's in a second language and a bachelor's science and engineering, was to simply look at the schedule and realize that you can't schedule labs at the same time that you're requiring students to take the language classes of this. And the story of this was just that how they solved the problem was just a great one of fences, that the chair of the German department happened to live next door to the chair of one of the engineering departments, and they were working on a fence together and had this conversation and realized literally over the fence that if they moved the schedule around that they might be able to increase the number of students studying languages to that. Another example, this again to the worst enemies, for many years I ran a program in Japan that was a science and engineering research program sending undergraduate students to work in Japanese labs. Most US students don't study Japanese. And one of the things we did, we put them through a 3-week immersion in Japanese language course before they did that. Partly it was survival, partly it was to be able to function in the labs. A lot of it was part of the cross-cultural, because if you know anything about working in Japan, you know a lot about culture if you learn a lot about the language by just knowing things like honorifics and things of that sort to that. Interesting, when we did this, one of the groups that actually talked to us and tried to talk us out of doing this language were our Japanese colleagues, who were saying, we really want the students to have more time in the lab because we think that this language class is a distraction, and we're all going to speak English to them anyway, to this. And it took and again, sort of wrong message there to the students. So I share that as saying that while I think that these are not the same things, and I think you can have students, and we do have to be kind of realistic that that students are going into lots of places where they may not necessarily, where it's not realistic that they're going to necessarily know language, and cultural competency is certainly a component to that. I don't want to downplay the importance of language study, and I think that there's also sort of a kind of a reconsideration in our own kind of academic environments about what messages are we really sending to this, and what can we do to just make it possible there for this to be something that is really part of the curriculum. Yes, Mark?
I just wanted to, another piece of that I think is the length of a study or work abroad program.
Exactly.
How do you deal with that in terms of shorter programs allow, in theory, more people to go abroad, but we also know the longer you're there, the more in-depth you're feeling and gaining these cultural intelligence skills. So how do you balance that at your universities?
Yeah. So again, really big issue. So if you look at trends nationally, looking at trends in the United States, 60% of students who participate in abroad programs are participating in programs that are 6 weeks or less. Our numbers at Lehigh look entirely like that as well. And there's a lot of really practical reasons that are driving that. The intensity of the curriculum, the cost, time to get to graduation. Those are all kind of factors there that are issues there with that. At the same time, there is a difference between being in country for 4 or 5 weeks on experience and being there for a year. And interesting, when the Institute for International Education released this multi-year study looking at the impact of experiences abroad on employability, found that there was a difference between those students who had been abroad longer versus those who had been abroad for shorter periods of time. So I think it's a challenge to that. All of that said, I think what it comes back to is that I think the most important thing that can happen in designing abroad experiences is intentionality on that. And that I think most of us are well past the point of just thinking that you just got to toss students in and sink or swim, they'll learn. It doesn't happen that way. Instead, it's sort of building and kind of wrapping around exactly the kinds of skill sets that the colleague was talking about to this. And I think anybody who's doing it well is looking at ways to do that. I'll also add, and this is something that we're seeing quite a bit, it's happening some with, again, with things like the Lehigh Mountaintop experience, but it's happening in other ways as well. of kind of changing up how we think about mobility. That mobility doesn't have to be always, you know, the going in and out of the country, but there's a lot of other ways that continues. And I think our colleagues, even in the earlier session, I think some of the things of talking about kind of virtual connections to that. And so we're also seeing increasingly sort of link the time sort of being what maybe you're in country. I'll use our Cambodian mushroom project as an example. They were in country for really, I think, about 3 weeks with that, but the engagement on that project was a year long. And so, it continued in different ways there to that. And that sort of begins to address a kind of reality of of what the students are trying to balance and what they can, and all the constraints that go with travel. With realism of you don't come in and you learn a culture, an ecosystem, an environment by just dropping in and out for that. And I think that's a place where you begin to see some of that balance.
And just further on that, I think it's important to step back and really examine what are the long-term goals that one wants from mobility, or even not even mobility, but international or global experiences. What is it you're trying to accomplish? And there are many mechanisms for accomplishing that. Time in country is, of course, one. But recognizing that these experiences should be accessible to all students, regardless of their socioeconomic status. There are family obligations, mental health considerations. That's maybe not always possible. And we often forget that international mobility is two ways. Often there's a huge disconnect between our domestic students and the international students on our campuses, and how are we enriching our understanding right here. Our communities that have community members from all sorts of different cultures that we're not necessarily engaging with. So there are a number of ways to have these kind of intercultural experiences, but what's often missing is a sense of what's the actual goal and what are we using to measure that we're getting there. And that's often not there. And we substitute that, or proxy for that is, you know, let's send X number abroad. Let's have X number of weeks. Let's do X number of this or that. And it's an activity-based rather than an outcome-based.
Very good points, and I see a lot of heads nodding, so I think there's a lot of like-minded individuals in the room. Great conversations, and it was wonderful to hear about Velocity, the Mountaintop Initiative. So thank you to John and Dr. McRae and Dr. Matherly.